The battlefield was not supposed to have survivors. That was the brutal arithmetic of the Kethran incursion. The alien forces had swept through the agricultural colony of Verdun 7 with mechanical precision, leaving behind nothing but ash and silence. The United Earth Expeditionary Corps had pushed them back, yes, but only after 3 days of scorched earth combat that had turned the colony's outskirts into a graveyard of twisted metal and broken stone. Sergeant Mara Ellison was not supposed to be here either. Her squad had pulled back to the secured perimeter 2 hours ago. She had stayed behind, officially to sweep for residual Kethran energy signatures, unofficially because something in her gut had refused to let her feet move toward the extraction point. 28 years old, decorated twice for valor, feared by her commanding officers for her stubbornness and beloved by her unit for exactly the same reason, Mara Ellison did not leave things undone. She moved through the rubble in silence, her scanner humming low against her palm, boots crunching over the charred remains of what had once been a thriving farming settlement. The air smelled of burning copper and rain. The twin moons of Verdun 7 hung low and pale in the sky, casting long silver shadows between the ruins. And then she heard it. A sound so small it nearly vanished beneath the wind. MRRR. MRRR. Mara stopped. She turned her head, scanning the wreckage with eyes trained to find threats, and instead found something that made her heart stutter sideways in her chest. Tucked between 2 collapsed support beams, half buried beneath a fallen roof panel, was a creature no larger than her forearm. It had 4 limbs, a tail that curled instinctively inward with fear, and a face that, despite the alien architecture of its wider-set eyes, its faintly luminescent fur, and the 2 tiny vestigial horns barely visible above its brow, was unmistakably that of a cub. A child. Lost and alone and crying. A Velhari cub. Mara's training flooded her mind with information at the same moment her heart flooded with something far less tactical. The Velhari were a species Earth had made first contact with 11 months ago, feline-descended, spacefaring, and deeply proud. They were allies of circumstance in the war against the Kethran, though allies was perhaps too warm a word for what was still a fragile, suspicious partnership. Velhari delegations met with Earth's ambassadors in sterile rooms with crossed arms and guarded eyes. They shared targeting data but not meals. They fought beside humans but did not yet trust them. And here, in the middle of a war zone that should have held nothing living, one of their youngest lay crying in the dark. "What are you doing here?" Mara thought. Then, immediately after, it doesn't matter. She moved. She moved without hesitation, without calculating the diplomatic implications, without asking her commanding officer for permission or consulting the 47 regulations that technically governed interaction with allied species non-combatant civilians. She crossed the rubble in a low sprint, knelt in the ash, and began carefully shifting debris with her bare hands, her gloves off before she'd consciously decided to remove them, because she needed to feel what she was moving, needed to be certain she didn't cause a collapse. "Hey," she said softly. Not to communicate, she had no Velhari, and the universal translator on her wrist wasn't calibrated for cub vocalizations. She said it simply because silence felt wrong. Because the tiny creature's luminescent eyes had fixed on her with an expression she recognized across every species boundary in the known galaxy, pure terror. "Hey. I've got you. I'm not going to hurt you." The cub Ikale, though Mara wouldn't know his name for another 6 hours, pressed himself flatter against the ground, his thin body trembling. He was perhaps 3 months old in Velhari terms, the equivalent of a human toddler, and he had been alone in the dark for God knows how long. His fur, which should have been a warm amber gold, was matted with grime and what Mara recognized with a clench of her jaw as dried blood. Not his own, she checked quickly with the scanner and found no wounds on him. Someone else's blood. Someone who had been with him and was no longer. She worked slowly. Deliberately. Talking the entire time in a low, steady voice, not because the words mattered but because her voice did, because every creature that had ever lived in fear understood the difference between a sound that meant danger and a sound that meant "I am not your enemy." It took 11 minutes to clear enough debris to reach him safely. When she finally extended her hand, palm up, fingers loose, the universal body language of offering rather than grasping, Cale stared at it for a long moment. His tiny chest heaved with rapid breaths. His tail lashed once, twice, with fright. And then, because he was exhausted and cold and alone, and because something in the ancient wiring of his brain recognized what Mara's posture was saying even if her species was foreign and strange, he stepped onto her hand. Mara exhaled slowly. She tucked him against her chest, inside her jacket, where her body heat could reach him. She felt him go rigid at first, every muscle coiled to flee, and she held completely still and let him make the decision. Let him feel her heartbeat, steady, unhurried, deliberate. Let him understand through sensation what she couldn't say in words. You are safe. I have you. I am not leaving. After 60 seconds, Cale's trembling slowed. After 2 minutes, he made a sound, low and uncertain, but not afraid. More like a question. After 5 minutes, he was asleep. The diplomatic incident that followed was, by all accounts, spectacular. Velhari High Commander Reth Saa did not take it well when informed that a human sergeant had removed a Velhari noble cub from a contested zone without authorization. The words grave violation and interspecies incident were used. There were 3 emergency communiques and 1 very uncomfortable video call between Earth's Ambassador Chen and Velhari Matriarch Sol. Mara sat through her debriefing with Cale still inside her jacket because no one could figure out how to separate them without distressing the cub further, and Cale had decided, with the absolute certainty that only the very young can feel, that the warm dark space against the human's heartbeat was his and he was not leaving it. The Velhari delegation arrived on the ESV Concordance 14 hours later. Mara was waiting in the docking bay, standing at ease, Cale now perched on her shoulder with his tiny claws hooked gently into the collar of her uniform, his amber eyes watching the bay doors with bright and curious interest. He had eaten emergency ration protein paste that Mara had fed him from her finger, which the ship's xenobiologist had confirmed was nutritionally adequate for young Velhari, and slept, and was now apparently conducting a thorough investigation of Mara's ear with one small paw. High Commander Reth Saa was the first through the doors. He was tall, imposing, his silver fur immaculate, his posture radiating the carefully maintained dignity of someone who had prepared to be very angry. He stopped when he saw Cale. Something moved through his expression, something that cracked the diplomatic severity open like light through a fissure. Cale saw him too. Made a sound. Reached out with both paws. Reth Saa crossed the bay in 3 long strides and took the cub from Mara's shoulder with hands that were, she noticed, not entirely steady. He held Cale against his chest and closed his eyes for just a moment that was not for anyone else, that she looked politely away from. When he opened them and looked at Mara, the anger was gone. You went back, he said. The translator rendered his voice in flat English syllables, but Mara heard the question underneath them. Why? Why would you go back? Why would you risk yourself for one of ours? Mara considered several answers. He was crying, she said finally. And I was there. Reth Saa was quiet for a long moment. In our culture, he said at last, the one who brings a lost cub home becomes bound to that cub's family. A protector bond. It is. He paused. It is not a small thing. I didn't know that, Mara said. I know, said Reth Saa. That is why it means more. The protector bond between Mara Ellison and the family of Cale Vera was the first of its kind in human Velhari history. It did not end the war. It did not solve the 1,000 complicated tensions still tangled between 2 species learning whether they could trust each other. It was not a treaty or a summit or a signed document. It was a small cat child asleep in the jacket of a human soldier who had decided, in the dark and the ash and the aftermath of terrible things, that the sound of crying was reason enough to stay. It turned out that was exactly the kind of reason that mattered most. Humanity, the Velhari philosophers would later write, does not calculate before it acts with kindness. This is, perhaps, their greatest danger to those who wish them ill, and their greatest gift to those fortunate enough to become their friends. Word count, 1600 genre, HFY, characters, Mara Ellison, Kale Vera.